The aptly named Spanish ship of the line Glorioso, or Glorious, or occasionally the Glorious One, began life with relatively little fanfare compared to the epic nature of her final voyage. But she would go on to exhibit a tenacity and fighting spirit that more than lived up to her title during that mission. Our story begins back in October 1738, when a pair of 70-gun third-rate ships of the line were laid down, Invincible and Glorioso, Invincible and Glorious in English. Now, these ships were not laid down in Spain, as you might expect. Instead, they were built in Havana in Cuba, as the Spanish Navy had a well-developed set of shipyards in its Caribbean colonies that would turn out a number of other notable large warships, including, a little bit later on, Nuestra Señora de la Santísima Trinidad. The two ships would be built over the course of 3 years by the naval architect Juan de Acosta, a Creole officer who'd previously built a set of 4 60-gun ships, as well as a 64-gunner and a frigate. The variety of wood available in the Central American forests, and the fact that these forests were largely untouched at this point in time, meaning it was all old-growth wood, meant that Spanish ships built here usually had a reputation for incredible toughness, partly thanks to the fact that wood like mahogany was used for major structural elements, whilst a lighter type of cedar was used for general planking in most of the ships that were constructed there. Since the trees grew in a rather hot and humid environment with a lot of pest species, they were naturally a bit more resistant to a lot of common pests as far as wooden warships went, and tended to last longer than ships built in Spain itself, especially since large numbers of Spanish ships tended to spend a lot of their operational life in the tropics at this point. Indeed, one Spanish official went on record in 1712 suggesting that a ship built in the imperial shipyards in Vizcaya, in Spain, might last about 10 years in service, whilst an identical ship built in the West Indies should last over 30, a sentiment that seems to have endured in most Spanish naval circles until well into the 19th century. Rigging, sails, and artillery, however, were still manufactured in Spain, which meant that many outbound merchant vessels would often be carrying these items as part of their cargo to help outfit the warships that were under construction in the Caribbean. Occasionally, an old warship would be sent to the Caribbean for breaking up, not because the additional transatlantic voyage itself was particularly useful, but because it meant that the still useful parts of the ship, like salvageable nails, rigging, sails, and the ship's armament, could be offloaded directly into the Havana warehouses and then reused, which would reduce the amount of valuable and vulnerable gear that needed to be moved across the Atlantic by the merchant trade, and also meant that the merchant trade could carry more valuable trade goods. In Glorioso's case, her iron guns came from the foundry of La Cavada in Spain, with 4 bronze guns added to the ship which originated from Seville. Her armament consisted of 28 guns on her lower gun deck firing 24-pound shot, 30 guns on the upper gun deck firing 18-pound shot, and a dozen 8-pounders on the upper deck split between the fore and aft castles, although not evenly. This made up her official 70-gun armament, with the 4 bronze guns likely either being signal guns or more likely some kind of small cannon, perhaps mounted on the quarterdeck. The Spanish records that talk about these guns are a little bit unclear, at least to me, but they do reference them as being stone throwers, as opposed to the more regular iron shot-equipped guns of the main battery. Whilst a 70-gunner might sound like it's a fraction smaller than a regular third rate to those of us who are more familiar with 74-gunners and 80-gunners, which are the typical third rates of the Napoleonic Wars, back in the late 1730s and the early 1740s, Glorioso represented a significant step up in size and lethality for the average third rate of the Spanish Armada, which, as might be guessed from the previous orders that Juan de Acosta had filled, was more used to 60-gun ships in this role. For comparison, whilst British construction at this time did also feature 70-gun ships, the vast majority of their construction for ships of the line was still 50-gun and 60-gun ships. Unfortunately, whilst much correspondence about the ship's construction survives in Spanish archives, it seems likely that the actual plans for her were amongst the documents lost when the British took Havana in 1762, a couple of decades after the ship was built. Although one interesting detail that does survive is, in common with other Spanish ships of this period, she actually had two names, one of which had religious connotations. In this case, Glorioso is also referred to in correspondence as the Saint Ignatius of Loyola, or more properly in Spanish, San Ignacio de Loyola. This was a trend that had mostly petered out by the end of the 18th century, but was quite prevalent at this point. In any case, at the start of 1742, the ship was crewed for the first time and made ready for sail, with 611 men aboard, sitting in Havana as the largest ship of a small fleet that was sitting in Havana harbour, which included La Reina, Real Familia, San Antonio, Santiago, Fuerte, Castilla, Santa Ana, Príncipe, Nueva España, San Luis, San Ciriaco, San Mateo, Nuestra Señora del Carmen, San Lorenzo, and Nuestra Señora de la Pena de Francia. She would serve for the next 6 years without much of note to her record, as whilst the War of the Austrian Succession raged for much of the 1740s and Spain had become more directly involved in war with the UK slightly earlier thanks to the War of Jenkins' Ear, much of the naval action in the West Indies had taken place while she was still under construction. A blockade of the Spanish mainland coast by the British had led to a suspension of regular merchant trade, and so a lot of silver and gold was accumulating from the Spanish holdings in South America, with much of it being stored in Havana, along with other valuable trade goods ranging from sugar to cheese to vanilla. Of course, the more these valuables gathered, and would obviously need at some point to be shipped to Spain, the more and more interested the British became, as a taste for Spanish gold and silver was something of a legacy from the era of Drake and Hawkins. This led to her one major set of voyages before her epic final one. In 1744, the Glorioso and the Castile were loaded up with just over 8.25 million silver pesos. 4 frigates, 2 Spanish and 2 French, had just over 700,000 pieces of 8 split between them, and with the Príncipe and Europa assigned as escort. Notionally, of course, this meant there were 4 ships of the line and 4 frigates in the convoy, but the plan, if the enemy found them, was for the 2 escorting ships of the line to go into battle and the treasure ships to just run for it. A British force 3 times as strong was waiting in Port Royal, Jamaica, for word of the sailing of the Spanish treasure fleet. However, just as the Spanish fleet set out, a massive hurricane swept over Port Royal, sinking or stranding 96 merchant ships as well as 9 of the warships that were anchored there, with only the dismasted HMS Ripon left still afloat. Whilst the tail end of the hurricane damaged the Príncipe and forced it back to port, the rest of the Franco-Spanish squadron got clear of the Caribbean and made it to Spain without any incident, landing the gold, silver and a large haul of other valuable trade goods in full. Glorioso now spent some time operating from Spain, sailing with the San Felipe, Castile and Europa to escort the Asia, another treasure ship which had sailed from Buenos Aires in late 1745. But in early 1746, a patrol mission went badly wrong when a severe storm scattered the squadron. Some of them managed to arrive with severe damage in various ports, but Glorioso was missing, feared sunk. Ships were sent out to try and find her, with no result. The squadron had sailed from Ferrol on the northwestern tip of Spain, but after a couple of months, Glorioso was spotted entering Cadiz, at the other end of Spain, on the southwestern coast. Quite where she'd been in the intervening time, unfortunately seems to be another part of another lost set of records. She was, however, in need of significant repair, and so she wouldn't be ready to sail again until the end of September. After being recrewed, further poor weather kept the ship in port until the end of December, when she sailed as part of a significant convoy, most of which was headed to Veracruz in what is now Mexico. most of the ships were warships that were doubling up as cargo ships due to the dangerous nature of the route, there being a war on it and all, with her own holds taking a large amount of general supplies and specifically ironwork, such as nails and framing, for the Havana shipyards where she'd been built. The convoy arrived in spring 1747, and in late May, having seen her charges safely to their various destinations in Spanish-controlled areas of the Caribbean, Glorioso set sail once more under the command of Pedro Mesía de la Cerda, 5th Marquis de la Vega de Armijo. Second in command was the slightly less titled Don Francisco de Leon y Guzman. In her hold was a mixed treasure including over 4 million pesos, which had built up in the Caribbean over the past few years. It was hoped this time that the ship might be able to make better progress alone, much as the Asia had done, and would be better able to sneak past the enemy without having to worry about other ships if it did this. Initially, this all seemed to work out. 2 months passed from the time she set sail, and then on the 25th of July 1747, at about 1 o'clock in the morning, the ship found itself sailing through a thick fog, when 10 sails were spotted ahead. Unable to make out their identity, thanks to the fog, the captain ordered Glorioso to keep to windward. This kept the ship concealed, as the light winds didn't seem to really move the fog all that much, but then around noon the sun burned away the fog and revealed a convoy of 13 merchant ships escorted by the 60-gun HMS Warwick, the 40-gun HMS Lark, and the 20-gun HMS Beaufort, along with the sloop Montague. As the Beaufort was carrying troops, it was left to guard the convoy while Captain John Cruikshanks, who was unfortunately not a large orange cat in a hat, ordered the other 3 to pursue from his post aboard the Lark. Since he was the senior-most officer, he was in command of the convoy despite the Warwick being the largest ship. Captain Erskine of the Warwick and Captain Cruikshanks were not on the best of terms, and this would be reflected in subsequent events. Seeing a large, lone Spanish warship wallowing quite heavily on a course to Spain, Cruikshanks had realised immediately that this was a classic treasure galleon moment. Initially, his pursuit, though, didn't amount to much other than moving the Lark and the Warwick across to the appropriate side of the convoy, as Glorioso was running on a parallel course, so they could take their time corralling it and coming up with a plan. But late in the afternoon, the Montague, which had been dispatched to keep a closer eye on Glorioso, signalled by gunfire and flares that the Spanish ship had changed course. Therefore, the 3 ships, Montague, Warwick and Lark, set out after their slower Spanish prey. Although having the individually largest ship present, and by far the most powerful, as Warwick carried 18-pounders and 9-pounders against Glorioso's 24-pounders and 18-pounders, de la Cerda was well aware that his primary mission was to get the treasure to Spain, and so he ordered 2 guns from each gun deck to be relocated to the stern chaser ports, and then set all sail away from the enemy. Overnight, the Montague kept up a sporadic exchange of gunfire designed primarily to keep the Spanish crew awake and thus tire them out, whilst the Lark and the Warwick slowly caught up. By dawn on the 26th, the latter 2 had closed to within 1.5 miles of Glorioso. The light winds had meant that the overhaul was a painfully slow process, and aside from continued fire from the Montague, nothing much happened over the course of the 26th. The British plan, it seemed, was for Warwick and Lark to overhaul Glorioso over the following night, and then drop back down on her, bracketing the ship with gunfire and hopefully forcing her to surrender. Realising something like this was coming as evening closed in, Glorioso made the first move. Setting every last scrap of canvas she had, the ship suddenly bore down on the Montague, which was making another harassing pass. After a full volley of heavy shot had sent the sloop reeling away, it thought better of any future action with the larger Spanish ship. But this action also meant that Glorioso was borne down alongside the upcoming Lark, and forced into another fight almost immediately. This action was short and sharp, lasting about 5 minutes according to both sides, with the records of ammunition expended by the Lark indicating that approximately 6 broadsides were exchanged in this time period, with solid shot being fired by the lower guns, and first grape shot and then bar shot from the upper guns, trying to reduce Glorioso's crew count and then trying to bring down the masts and rigging. But the Glorioso got the better of the engagement, the lower gun batteries savaging the frigate's hull and the upper batteries cutting up its rigging, particularly the mizzenmast, which collapsed. The Lark broke off from the fight, leaving De la Zerda with a choice. He could try and slip away in the night, or he could keep up the fight. Having had quite enough of running at this point, De la Zerda chose violence and swung the Glorioso around, heading straight back at the Warwick, which was now left unsupported and badly outgunned. But this was not some berserker charge. De la Zerda still knew his mission and had carefully laid plans to unleash at close range. Passing Warwick, the Glorioso let fly with a full broadside from her port guns before swinging back around and coming close abreast with the 60-gunner, with the sailor on the Lark recounting what happened next. The two ships being then abreast, the Glorioso began to fire her guns deliberately and slowly into the Warwick, till she carried away the Warwick's main topmast, wounded her lower masts, shattered her sails and tore her rigging, but killed only 2 men and 1 boy. The Warwick fired large numbers of guns at a time in a confused, hasty manner, and then made long pauses. The explosions of the powder from the guns enabled the people on board the Lark to see the hulls of both ships, at times as plainly as if they'd been illuminated on purpose. De la Zerda was aiming to rapidly cripple his opponent's propulsion above all else, thus preventing any further pursuit of his ship. The fight had begun at about 10 o'clock in the evening, but then the wind died, falling to complete stillness by midnight, which left the two ships alongside each other. By 3 in the morning, the cannon on both sides was still firing, but the Lark was still standing by watching, an act for which Captain Crookshanks would subsequently be court-martialed and dismissed from the service for. At about 3:15, the wind rose again, and Captain Erskine, aboard the Warwick, largely dismasted, decided that he'd had enough and pulled away before hoisting lanterns from what was left of his masts, a signal that both sides recognised as the nighttime signal of a ship in distress. Glorioso had not come away entirely unscathed from an unplanned 5-hour gunnery duel, as her captain recorded. I had no shroud, no fathom, no yardarm that was not broken, and all the beams were damaged. I ordered my carpenters to reconnoitre the masts, and I found them all but the bowsprit and part of the mainmast unable to serve. The mast captains of the main and foremast had different challenges, with the condition of the foremast being so bad that at 8 o'clock in the morning I ordered men to reconnoitre the mast below the decks, where I found it had been hit by 5 cannon shot. 3 sailors and 2 passengers had been killed. 6 more sailors and a marine would die of their wounds in the coming days. Almost 1,000 cannon shot and over 4,500 musket rounds had been expended. As the ship made its way slowly from the convoy, the carpenters gradually patched up the ship as best they could, shoring up the masts, replacing severed lines and shredded sails, and plugging holes in the hull. Gradually regaining some of its sailing capability, the Glorioso made its way towards Spain, this combat having taken place a couple of 100 miles north of the Azores. Then, almost 3 weeks later, on August the 14th, 3 ships were seen dead ahead. These were the 50-gun HMS Oxford, the 24-gun frigate HMS Shoreham, and the 14-gun sloop HMS Falcon. With still diminished sails, the enemy between them and Spain, and a slower ship even if everything had been intact, the Glorioso could do nothing but turn slightly and force the British ships to try and overhaul her. The 3 British vessels tried for a similar tactic to Crookshanks, aiming to overhaul the Glorioso on either side and bracket it with gunfire. However, once more the Spanish 70-gunner stole the initiative. As soon as he saw Oxford passing her stern and making a turn into pursuit, De la Zerda wheeled his ship about once again and bore down on the Oxford. In his own words, "When we were equal, he gave me his discharge, which I reciprocated with mine, from both of the main gun decks. As well as the big enemy ship, the 2 little ones also gave me their discharge. I tacked on the big ship again and lowered the foremast sails to reach it, passing through its leeward on account of being unable to use my lower battery with the great sea that was in the air, as I had experienced in the first salvo a flooding of water on the lower gun deck. He never wanted to show me his side, and the little ships went to windward. We fired from one side to the other with 2 volleys, and the larger enemy ship tried to get out of my fire and escape. At 7 o'clock in the evening, he made a course to the south-southeast, leaving me victorious, so I girded the wind to the southeast, and when night came on, I lost sight of them. The fight had taken almost 3 hours, but the Glorioso had actually sustained relatively little damage. 5 men lightly wounded, and some damage to the rigging and the foremast. In exchange, all 3 British ships were badly damaged and had been forced to break off the action. Captain Callis of the Oxford was also court-martialed, but, unlike Crookshanks, he was acquitted. It seems that the high seas had prevented the use of most of the guns on all the ships involved, but with being larger, Glorioso had the advantage of height, and so whilst her 24-pounder battery had frequently been underwater, necessitating the closure of the gun ports, she had been able to consistently use her 18-pounder battery, which in itself matched the lower and often unusable gun deck of the Oxford, which had thus placed the firepower advantage heavily in Glorioso's favour. Her lower 24-pounders on the windward side had also been able to be brought into play against the Oxford as the ships heeled heavily in the high winds once De la Zerda had made the appropriate manoeuvres. By the end of the day, Glorioso had sighted Cape Finisterre, although with evening the wind died again, and was followed by a thick fog, and so the ship headed south until it cleared the fog, eventually finding shelter in the small town of Corcubillon, which had fallen on hard times in the past few decades, such that the arrival of Glorioso meant that her crew now outnumbered the town's population. Realising, however, that another passing British formation could thus enter the bay and take the ship since there were no fortifications, the crew set about 3 major tasks. Firstly, they had to get the treasure off the ship and stored somewhere inland. Secondly, they took some guns from the ship and set up defensive batteries to cover the harbour entrance. And third, they had to effect repairs on their ship, which had accumulated a reasonable degree of damage. Letters were sent by courier to Corunna, including a request to have new masts prepared, and soon several units of troops were marching overland to secure the gun batteries that the crew had set up, as well as the ship's cargo, whilst 5 small galleys with fresh ammunition and general supplies were sent by sea to replenish the ship. However, the warehouses of Corunna were almost empty, and so instead of new masts, the galleys in this respect brought just 2 replacement mastheads and 1 replacement sail. But for his bravery, they also brought a letter that promoted De la Zerda to Commodore. Repairs to the ship went on, along with enlarging the gun batteries ashore, for the treasure still needed to be guarded as it was stored in a local church and wouldn't be taken onwards to the city of Santiago until mid-September, when sufficient carts and guards could be found. In the interim, the ship positioned itself to face its broadside down the bay, and the gun batteries also kept an eye out for potential attackers, as the coastline was rather crowded with British ships. Indeed, the resupply galleys often had to take cover in ports between Corunna and Corcubillon in order to evade British pursuit. The full extent of the ship's treasure was tabulated as it was relocated, consisting of 940,486 pesos in gold, 3 million pesos in silver, 100 tons of copper, 74 tons of fine grain, 281,092 vanilla pods, plus significant quantities of ink, cheese, dye, sugar, balm, cocoa, and 300 hides. To put this in some kind of context, the value of this cargo was somewhere between 7 and 12 times that of the cargo that was lost on the frigate Nuestra Señora de la Mercedes, which was salvaged in the 21st century, the subject of quite some dispute at the time, but was eventually valued just in terms of its silver and gold, the rest obviously having rotted away, at over $500 million. which puts the value of Glorioso's cargo at something in the region of $5 billion, give or take a little depending on the exact estimated value of some of those smaller items. British intelligence on the Spanish coast was surprisingly good, and it seems they were in a position to intercept and duplicate, and therefore read, all of the letters that were passing from Corcobian to Ferrol and Corona, as well as all the returning correspondence. So they knew exactly where the ship was, and they knew that most of the treasure had been offloaded and was on its way by stages to Madrid. However, the British intelligence agents getting this information and then distributing this information to various ships at sea were two entirely different matters, the latter taking a lot longer. By September, most of the damage to Glorioso had been repaired, except for the shot-riddled masts, but the crew had been somewhat reduced by desertions. A company of grenadiers and a detachment of regular infantry was thus ordered aboard to make up the numbers, the guns were remounted, and on the 5th of October, the Glorioso set sail for Ferrol for a complete overhaul. This was aborted by the discovery of 15 British warships in the way, so they headed back and tried again on the 11th. By the 14th, she'd managed to reach Cape Finisterre, but then a violent storm swept down, and with her masts barely holding together, standing against the wind was considered impossible, and instead they were forced to run with it, the storm bearing them south until the only viable port left was Cadiz. As the wind finally died, somewhere in the vicinity of Cape St. Vincent on the 17th, they spotted a dozen sails on the horizon. A number of these turned and began to close on the Glorioso. These were the ships under the command of the privateer George Walker. His ships were commonly nicknamed the Royal Family, as they were named King George, Prince Frederick, Prince George, Duke, Princess Amelia, and Prince Edward. Each was a frigate of some description, and between them they carried 114 guns and 1,000 men. As far as the privateering group knew, the intelligence not having quite reached them yet, Glorioso still had her treasure aboard. But the wind in their patch of the sea died, leaving only the leading ships of the pack with enough air in their sails to continue their pursuit. At the head of the three ships that had cleared the doldrums was the King George, pierced for 26 guns, all of which were 9-pounders. In the 2 years that the royal family had operated together, they'd netted prizes to the value of about £400,000, which is something in the region of about £1 billion in today's money. That was no mean feat, and indeed Walker is sometimes listed as the most successful privateer of the 18th century. But lying ahead of him seemed an opportunity to quintuple his takings in one fell swoop. Indeed, in the aftermath of subsequent events, when Walker was heavily criticised by the royal family's owners for taking several frigates up against a large ship of the line, he just justified it by saying, well, if that ship had all the treasure we thought it had aboard, you'd be singing a very different tune if I hadn't engaged it, which seemed to have drawn a line under the matter. But, nonetheless, the patch of dead air advanced and caught up with them with the King George and Prince Frederick in cannon range, but they held their fire, as Glorioso was not flying its flags, and they didn't want to risk firing on a potentially friendly Portuguese ship. Seeing a chance for deception, De la Zerda closed his lower gun ports and made off towards the coast when the breeze rose again around 5 in the afternoon. Now only the King George had caught enough of the breeze to keep up the pursuit, and she managed to come alongside at dusk. First, Walker had a crewman who spoke Portuguese ask for the larger ship's identity in that language. This received no answer, so he tried again in English, and an English speaker aboard Glorioso replied, asking for the name of his ship. When Walker replied that he was in command of the King George, the lower gun ports of Glorioso opened, a Spanish flag was raised, and the 70-gun ship of the line opened fire on the small frigate at point-blank range. Despite the topsails being immediately shredded and 2 of his guns dismounted, Walker returned fire as best he could. Realising that there was absolutely no chance of winning a straight artillery duel, he tried to use the large marine contingent he had aboard to level the playing field. He wrote, James Riddle, our captain of marines, commanded these firings so resolutely, regularly, and quickly that the muskets grew so hot in the hands of the men as to oblige them during the action to take no less than 3 changes of musket. But with the illumination of a full moon, de la Zerda knew that he held all the cards but one as the musket fire swept his deck, and so to remedy that one disadvantage, he simply pulled away outside of small arms range and pounded the King George to splinters. Soon, the captain of the King George recounted, "We had received many shots in our hull, yet from the great number fired, our rigging could not boast of any escape, for all our braces and main topsail yards were shot away, the foremast quite disabled, and the mainmast damaged. We could not work our ship. Blazing scraps of sails fell on the deck, and cannon fire from the frigate slackened as the men did their best to put out the actual fires all around them. The Prince Frederick finally arrived, having struggled in the light airs to make some headway, and tried to distract the Glorioso with sporadic fire from whatever guns it could bring to bear. The return fire caused casualties, but not a huge amount of damage, and when the wind rose around 11 o'clock in the evening and Glorioso made off into the night, her captain judged it wiser to assist the King George instead of trying to fight the Glorioso alone. During this entire time, for some reason, the fort on Cape St. Vincent was firing somewhat randomly at all ships involved, with the British being of the opinion that a good number of the Portuguese cannonballs had hit them, and the Spanish equally convinced that the fort's guns were firing at Glorioso in defence of the frigates. Come morning on the 18th of October, the Prince George and the Duke had caught up. Walker told both of them and the Prince Frederick to continue the pursuit, whilst the King George effected repairs. As the Glorioso headed for one horizon with its 3 small pursuers following, another ship showed up on the other horizon, the much larger, if slightly odd, 80-gun 3-decker HMS Russell. Having gathered the situation from the King George, Russell set off in pursuit as well. Seeing the odds well and truly against him with this new arrival, de la Zerda made all sail for safety no matter the risks to the masts. Then, up ahead, another ship was spotted, this one not flying any flag. Upon being challenged, it hoisted the Danish flag and, using a Spanish signal code, signalled Glorioso. De la Zerda, however, was suspicious and kept on going. Seeing this, the mystery ship lowered the Danish flag and instead hoisted the red ensign, revealing itself to be the 50-gun HMS Dartmouth. Glorioso turned to try and get a full broadside off on the closing ship, but Dartmouth, aware of the disparity of firepower, used its greater agility to avoid being raked and instead swung up alongside Glorioso, letting loose with a coordinated rolling broadside as the ship ranged up the length of the Spanish vessel. A lively exchange of gunfire ensued for a short time, until suddenly Dartmouth exploded. One of the handful of survivors, an Irish Lieutenant O'Brien, recounted what happened. "I was sent by my captain Hamilton to tell the battery commander to load all guns with grape shot, but when I was halfway there I was introduced to the master gunner in charge of the main battery. He was in a state of great nervousness, wild and trembling, asking about the captain's situation. I asked him if anything was wrong, and he managed to say, 'Oh, sir, the magazine!' There was no time for more, for at that very moment there was a huge explosion. When I regained consciousness, I was floating in the middle of the ocean, clinging to a cannon carriage. I was picked up by the Prince Frederick, offered first my salute to Captain Dottin, and said, 'Sir, you must excuse the unfitness of my dress to come aboard a strange ship, but really I left my own in such a hurry that I had no time to stay for a change.' The privateer frigates paused to pick up the few survivors of the Dartmouth before being overhauled by the Russell, which had at first thought that one of the small privateer frigates had gotten itself destroyed. Apprised of the reality of the situation, Russell bore on, leading the 3 smaller ships. However, whilst casualties were relatively light on Glorioso, with 5 killed and 20 wounded, the short gun battle and then the blast of Dartmouth detonating had further damaged the perilous rigging. Some of it had collapsed, but they were so close to home now that everything was tried to get more sail up and increase speed. Alas, it was not enough, and as night fell, the Russell got closer and closer. The Spanish, seeing a somewhat dumpy three-decker, naturally assumed she was a 92-gun second-rate, not that it really mattered all that much. Around midnight, her final battle began. Russell came alongside at close range and began exchanging broadsides, whilst the frigates took their turns to try and rake the Glorioso, which couldn't turn away from her larger enemy for fear of being raked by the far more substantial main battery of that ship. By 3 in the morning, Glorioso had begun to run short on ammunition. She'd not actually been fully restocked whilst in her temporary port, coming out of it with only about 60% of her magazine full. Forced to switch from round shot to bar shot, then to grape shot, then to anything that came to hand, by 4 in the morning on the 19th, she was also running out of those, and the cabin boys were sent to try and find any and all loose items that might be used as projectiles. Bags of nails, smaller ballast stones, and even some of the more easily prized off bits of the ship were loaded and duly fired. Dawn rose about 6 in the morning, and at last Glorioso's guns began to fall silent, every ounce of gunpowder and every possible implement aboard having been fired at the enemy. The masts had fallen one by one quite a while back, and there was water pouring in from multiple holes in the waterline. Finally, her flag came down, and Glorioso surrendered. With both Russell and Glorioso having no intact boats, Russell was forced to borrow one from one of the frigates in order to take the Spanish ship's surrender. The majority of the ship's crew was loaded into the privateer frigates and sent on to Lisbon, with the officers and the remaining sailors taken aboard the Russell, whilst some of the frigate's men and some from the Russell boarded the Glorioso to try and make repairs and then navigate her to the nearest British-held or British-friendly port. However, the damage on all sides was so great that a week later, the two ships were still bobbing about off Cape St. Vincent effecting repairs, in the course of which it was of course discovered that Glorioso carried no treasure any longer, the only prizes being her guns and the thoroughly riddled hull. Patched up enough to get going, Russell and Glorioso decided they were going to go for the nearest friendly port, that being Lisbon, on the 30th of October, she arrived. The Spanish officers were permitted parole to stay at the residence of the Spanish ambassador, and after some negotiations the regular crew were released and began their journey back to Spain on foot. Both ships were refitted in Lisbon whilst the fate of Glorioso was decided. The King of Portugal offered to buy her for £30,000, which was about 15% more than what she'd cost the Spanish crown to build. But without the determination of a prize court, Captain Buckle of the Russell wasn't technically allowed to take up this very tempting offer, worth about £70 million in today's money. Instead, the Admiralty instructed him to bring the ship to Portsmouth, where a prize court could adjudicate. The two ships arrived in Portsmouth in May 1748, where Glorioso was reserved for examination and the prize court's determination, whilst Russell continued up onto Chatham for a full refit. After deducting the costs that had been incurred getting her to Portsmouth, the ship was assessed at a prize value of £14,209, 7 shillings and 2.5 pence. All things considered, Captain Buckle probably thought he'd have been better off just selling her in Lisbon. At just over double the money, he could easily have paid off any fines that might have resulted from the sale using just a fraction of the difference, especially given that she eventually sold at auction for only £12,100, the Admiralty refusing to buy her into service at their valued estimate on account of her combat damage and the fact she'd been sitting in Portsmouth for so long that her hold had flooded. She was then taken apart for her cedar and mahogany, both rather prized in the making of furniture, with an estimated realised resale value of the timbers, not accounting for the windows, rigging, brass fixtures and fittings, etc., of, ironically enough, about £30,000 for the lucky buyer of the hull. The Spanish officers were taken to the UK as prisoners, but they were eventually exchanged back. De la Zerda eventually wound up back in the Caribbean. By 1753 he was in charge of a trade protection flotilla, and in 1760 he became Viceroy of New Granada, before retiring back to Spain in 1772, where he remained until his death in 1783, much admired for his exploits aboard the Glorioso by both Spanish and British sailors. As far as I can tell, only one other ship has subsequently borne the name Glorioso under the Spanish flag, this being a 74-gunner, which was also known as San Francisco Javier, built shortly after the loss of the original. She entered service in 1755 and remained in the Spanish Navy until 1818, when she was sold for breaking up. Who knows, perhaps it's time for another ship to pick up this very illustrious torch.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.